Hi everybody, it's Dr. McDowell. Today we're talking about Chapter 9, which is Managing Young Adolescents and Environments, Strategies, and Techniques. So I opened with this graphic from page 203 in our textbook, and it talks about the different levels of community that a student belongs to within a school. So at the very center is the individual student, and then the next community that they identify with would be their small group of friends, um, or acquaintances. And then within there, they move on to the individual teacher's classroom. So you might have one student, let's call her Tiffany. Tiffany identifies with a small group of friends. Okay, they play in the playground together, they talk and sit at the cafeteria together, they do all their things together. And then who is that group of students within the classroom? All right, so there might be a small group that she works with within the classroom. Let's say it's a sixth grade. And then from there, the community expands to the grade level team. So that would be all of Tiffany's sixth grade teachers. Now, depending on the size of the school district, Tiffany may have, there may be more sixth grade teachers that Tiffany doesn't have. So that would be the overall grade level community. So she may have a sense that there are these other sixth grade teachers and that there are other sixth grade students who are not in her classes. And then from there, we have the general school community. So this might be the whole middle school, grades 6th, 7th, and 8th. So in order to really connect with our students, we need to help our students find a connection to each of these communities. Students, if they don't feel connected, they're not going to be as engaged. I remember when I taught 8th grade, we would have a spirit week every semester where students, we would dress up. We would have like a duct tape day where we would wear duct tape all over our clothes. We would have pajama day, a crazy hair day, things like that. And I remember one student saying, I don't understand how this gives me school spirit, why they call it Spirit Week. And I'm like, well, I sat down and talked with her. I'm like, if everybody's participating, that means we're doing something together as a group. And she's like, okay. So she's like, if I'm choosing not to participate, that's why I don't feel the spirit. I'm like, exactly, exactly right. So we look for ways to get that connection. Um, This chapter focuses a lot about classroom management. There's a difference between discipline and management. Discipline is more it's more rule based. Like you'll give students directions like don't do this and don't do that. Like don't chew gum and don't sharpen your pencil until it's the last 5 minutes of class, and no talking and no wearing hoodies. Right? It's all a bunch of rules, and usually with a negative emphasis, like you cannot do this. It's not things you can do, things you cannot do. Where management is more of a student engagement perspective. And so you need to read pages 212 to 220 very carefully. I will talk a little bit about some of the different theorists, but you really need to read that carefully. Um, let's start on page 212. That has a beautiful little chart that briefly mentions the different theorists. We start with Cantor and Cantor. That's a very popular theory where we have assertive discipline, and that's the belief that both educators and students have rights in the classroom. Educators insist on responsible behavior and use a hierarchical list of consequences. Sometimes that hierarchical list is not always appropriate. And it can become kind of limiting. So let's say you have the rule where students should not be chewing gum. Well, then you'd have a list of consequences. So what would happen if a student does chew gum? Well, maybe they would have to go spit it out. Maybe they would have to wash desks. Maybe they would have to write a letter to their parents saying, "Oops, I made a mistake and chewed gum." I mean, they're consequences, right? And sometimes it just becomes such a like sometimes you just create more problems by penalizing students for every little infraction. So it can get a little touchy if you have too many consequences. Um, and then sometimes you gotta think about the big picture too. If two students get into a fist fight in the middle of class, well, I'm not saying we should endorse fighting. Please don't think that. But do wonder, like, what is the reasoning behind the fight? Is one kid self-defense? Is the other kid, does he have a weapon of some sort? So you don't want to just a blatant, a blanket list of, well, anybody who fights gets 5 days of in-school suspension. If one kid is literally self-defense, maybe you need to consider the situation. So what I'm saying is, with a hierarchical list of consequences, there's always going to be those it depends situations, and we need to be cognizant of that. So assertive discipline has a lot of good points to it, but it's not like the holy grail of classroom management. Then we have our democratic and cooperative classrooms. Rudolf Dreikers, he comes up with three different types of teachers: the autocratic, the permissive, and the democratic. And what's interesting about Dreikers' work is that he believes that all misbehaviors result from one of four goals. That students only misbehave in class for one of four reasons. He thinks that either they are trying to get attention, or they're trying to assert their power, or they're trying to get revenge, or they're feeling inadequate. And if you think about the reasons why students are acting out, you'll see that there's a lot of truth to what Dreikers is saying. A lot of students don't get the attention that they need at home. This goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If students aren't getting attention from mom and dad, they will find they get attention from you. And attention to them is attention. It doesn't matter if it's positive or negative. Sometimes you can correct their misbehavior by giving them positive attention. So instead of waiting for them to start talking in the middle of silent reading time, maybe talk to them before class starts. Maybe, see them in the hallway and make a point to say hi and check how their day is going. Um, Finding a way to give them a little bit of attention before they get bored and start looking for their own attention. Sometimes that works. Not always. Again, there's no one perfect way to manage your students. So we're going to study a bunch of theorists, but ultimately it's going to be a big combination of these different theorists that will probably work for you. Linda Albert is another popular theorist. She talks about cooperative discipline. She builds upon Dreikers' beliefs, his theories. She encourages teachers to work with parents and students to help identify what she calls the three C's: connecting, contributing, and feeling capable. Students need to be able to feel like they can complete their work. If a student doesn't feel like they can do it, guess what? They're not going to. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So make sure that your students feel capable. Make sure they feel a connection to you, to the assignment. Make sure they're contributing to the class, to their work. And she has a great list on the bottom of page 215 about ways to address different causes of behavior. So if students are reacting out because they need attention, then use eye contact. You will develop the teacher stare. I can do it, and I do it without even trying to a lot of the times. And I have a look where I've got it down. And all I have to do is give them that look for like a second. And a lot of times students will, stop whatever it is they're doing that's not the right behavior. Proximity is a great one. Move closer to the student while continuing to teach. And this is great because then you're not disrupting the whole class. You're not drawing attention to the student. You're just walking nearby. And sometimes that's all it takes to get them back and redirected. Ask a direct question or use student's name while continuing the lesson. So you could be reading aloud and then you could just be like, hey, Anthony, what did you think about this? And then you're saying the person's name, you're giving them attention, you're still keeping the class on task, and you're asking like an opinion question, right? Or what do you think about this? And so it's not really putting the student on the spot as where they can say a wrong answer unless they're like totally not paying attention, which is possible. And then give specific praise to a nearby student who is on task. Be careful of this. The way it's explained to me, don't become a fisheye with this. So what I mean is you might have, let's say you have 3 students like working in a small group. And let's say Anthony is not doing his assignment, but Margaret is. And so you might say, Margaret, I like the way that you got started right away. That's a good example of giving specific praise. But don't give Margaret the praise and then swivel your head and stare down Anthony. That's the fisheye. That's blatantly disrespecting Anthony, right? That's saying, hey, I can praise Margaret, but I'm not praising you. You gotta just praise Margaret and walk away, move on with your life. Remind students one time to do something and walk away, assume that they are going to do it, and then circle back at another time and see if they are. But if you assume compliance, sometimes students, then that breaks that power hierarchy that happens. So moving on to power, avoid direct confrontation. You need to pick your battles, okay? Because some students are just itching for a fight. And I don't mean a physical fight, but they just want to argue something. And they might choose you to be their target that day. You got to pick your battles. I knew a teacher who had a policy that they have a proper heading on their paper at all times. If they didn't, they got an automatic zero on the paper and could never redo it. To me, that wasn't a battle worth fighting. If a student forgets their name once in a while, I don't think the world's going to come to an end. But that was my philosophy, not my coworkers. Um, but I think giving students a little bit of credit once in a while and saying, "Hey, I think you forgot your name," I think that goes a long way with building that connection, that rapport, rather than doing an automatic zero policy. So avoid that direct confrontation because that's what students they're looking for a reason to get out of class, etc. Um, if students are trying to have a power trip, change the activity, do something unexpected. I have taught the class from top of my desk before. Like I've stood on it just to throw them off, and they're like, "Whoa, what's happening?" I'm like, "I'm reading my story," and they're a little, befuddled by my actions, but it worked. They were just like, "Okay, this is what we're doing now." And kind of change is good. Revenge is a little tricky. Some students like to revenge. So, right, if I say, no, you can't sharpen your pencil right now because I'm giving directions, they'll be like, fine, I'm not going to do it then, and slam their books. Well, they're seeking revenge on me, right, for not letting them sharpen their pencil when it's my turn to speak. Again, it goes back to picking your battles. So you can revoke a privilege in return, but sometimes that just creates a power dynamic, right? So, like, I don't know if you've ever seen, what's the movie? The Breakfast Club. There's a scene where one of the characters, the principal's giving him a detention, and every time the kid retorts, he adds another detention, and he ends up with like 2 months worth of detention. And like that's a power battle that was just unnecessary. Also consider your consequences because sometimes you're punishing yourself without even meaning to. Like in that movie, The Breakfast Club, that principal now has to give up 2 months of his Saturdays to run detention. So, wow, who won here? Now both the principal and the student are in school on Saturdays for 2 months. Not worth it. So be careful with revoking a privilege because it often will backfire. I'm not saying don't ever do it, but just be careful. If you are working with children like fourth or fifth grade, do not ever take away recess. That's such a common one, like, right? Students don't get their work done. I'm going to take away their recess time. Guess what? You're not going to get anywhere with that. That student is probably not getting their work done because they probably have the wiggles. They probably need to have some energy that they need to release. If you take away their recess, well, then they still are not getting a chance to release that energy, and so it's going to become more problematic as time goes on. So look for alternative ways. Um, if you flip back to page 210, there's like a little case study that the author asked you to consider, and they listed some different approaches to dealing with an issue. They're saying this teacher could have continually encouraged the student to complete an assignment. They could have praised minor efforts. Hey, you got your name on your paper. Great job. Now can we write one sentence? Now can we write one paragraph, right? Make it small. Could have varied her instructional strategies. She could have discussed the situation with his parents. She could have gotten help from the guidance counselor. She could have talked to her team of teachers to say, hey, what are some strategies you have for getting Patrick to engage in classes? So this goes back to that revoking a privilege. Try and find a different strategy because revoking a privilege usually doesn't work. But what does work is building a caring relationship and using affirmative statements. But make sure they're sincere because middle school students can tell when you're insincere. So if you're faking it, they'll know. And then avoidance of failure. Acknowledge the difficulty of the assigned task. If students are like, I can't do this, it's hard. Acknowledge that. Yes, it is hard, but I have faith that you can do it. How can I help you? Okay, so talk to them and make modifications. Break it down into smaller chunks. Make it more manageable. Try to describe it in a different way. Those are all possible examples. Then we talk about judicious discipline. Judicious discipline, the authors call this a lot of front loading, where we have the teachers and the students, they develop rules and expectations together. I hear this a lot in an idealistic way, where teachers like come up with a class contract and a class constitution. I have tried it a few times with my eighth graders, and what usually happened is 5 or 6 students were really engaged with this, and the rest of them were just bored out of their minds and couldn't care less. They just want to know what the rules were so they could get on with learning. and some just didn't take it seriously at all. So I would say if you are intrigued by judicial discipline, then go ahead and do some research on it, and give it a try. The thing is, it does take a lot of front loading, like the authors say, so you need time to set up expectations, set up procedures. So it does take some time, but if you have the time to develop into setting it up, it does work. It's just, yeah, it just not everything works for everybody. Jacob Conan goes into effective teaching with instructional management. He talks about with itness, and that means that teachers are aware of all events and activities and student behaviors in the classroom. So, when you say there's a teacher with an eyes in the back of his or her head, that's with itness, right? So I could be working with Joe on his fractions, and then without even looking up, I'll be like, Steven, get back in your seat and stop throwing paper like a basketball. And he'll know. He's like, man, how did you know I was doing it? I'm like, I just knew, right? You'll develop that sixth sense, that with itness. It does develop over time. But that is a very powerful way to, manage a classroom. Kunin goes in to describe some ways of behaviors that teachers can have without even trying to, that cause student disruption. And that's when, like satiation, when a teacher goes on too long about something. Like if I made this video 2 hours long, you would be so bored with it. I know you wouldn't listen to it. Um, and when that happens, students get bored. And so when students get bored, what they do, what anybody does, they look for something else to do. And that's when student behaviors start to come. He talks about jerkiness, where the teacher doesn't pace things very well. Um, They may use one activity and then suddenly change to another activity without any warning. Like we could be doing fractions. I'm like, okay, then let's move into grammar now, like right this second, without any smooth transition time. That's not very effective. That just kind of gets students in a little bit of a panic. And then they start talking to each other, and then the class gets off task. Flip-flopping is another one where if you're starting with fractions and then you move to grammar and then you go back to fractions and you're all over the place, and students are like, whoa, can we just stick with one thing, right? So our slowing down or overdwelling or fragmentation. These are all different behaviors that Jacob Conan theorizes about, that our authors discuss on page 216 and 217. Then we have Everton and Harris talking about learning-centered classrooms. You can read a little bit of that on your own. Then we have positiveness and dignity, and these are the theorists Guinot, Jones, Kerwin, and Mendler. And they basically, to sum up, they talk about basically respecting our students, and that is very important. We need to respect our students. There's that old saying, you have to show respect to gain respect, and that's true. If you show your students some respect, they will show you respect in return. You can't just start your classroom assuming that they're going to respect you because you're the teacher. In a perfect world, that would be the scenario, but we don't live in that perfect world. So showing students that you care and you respect them, and that could just be as simply as taking the time to learn their names, taking their time to remember a detail about their lives. Sometimes I would just call my students Mr. or Mrs. and their last name, just as a sign of respect. I wouldn't do it all the time, but I would do it sometimes. And they were like, huh, okay. It's just, if I want my students to do something, like if I need an errand run, right? I could say, hey, Joaquin, take this to the office. Or I could say, Joaquin, can you take this to the office, please? Right? It's just that little bit of respect. And when Joaquin comes back, what do? I thank him. Thank you for running that errand for me. Just a little respect goes a long way. If you respect your students, they will respect you in return. But if you don't respect your students, they will know. Trust me on that. So the idea of discipline and with dignity, moving on to Kerwin and Mendler, is that teachers need to help teach dignity as a long-term behavior change. So it's making big strides to recorrect students' behavior long term. Trying to think of another way to say that. Knowing that you're not going to, it's just one day of saying Mr. and Mrs. or sorry, Mr. and Miss to your students, or saying please and thank you is not going to change it. It's a long haul. Um, One example he gives is a teacher. She's like, well, I expect my students to do the homework, and so I reinforce that by grading it, right? Um, if I ask my students to do a paper and then I assign 2 more papers without grading the first paper, that's not respectful. I'm not respecting their time, and I'm not respecting their grades or their learning process by giving them feedback in a timely manner. Those are the things that Kerwin and Mindler are referring to. And then on page 225, there are a list of questions or statements that the author asked you to do, like reflect on young adolescent development, reflect on the teacher's beliefs about how classroom management should work. Think about how a classroom should be workable and efficient. If you take the time to work through those and think them through, that's going to help you with your middle level philosophy. So this video is getting a little long, and I don't want to satiate you, so I'm going to end it. But do take some time to read chapter 9 very thoroughly.